Welcome back to Out of Possession, and today I'm very excited because I've got a very special guest on. He's come back for his brace. It's Jon Mackenzie, and today we're going to be talking about your new book, The Spectre of Pep, and exploring all of the ghosts of Pep in world football. And naturally, I think the best place to start with that is Pep. So do you want to talk about why you chose to write a book on Guardiola specifically, and why not maybe another coach?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the context behind this is that I was approached by the publisher. They'd also published Inverting the Pyramid, which is Jonathan Wilson's famous tactics book, which is just an incredible exploration of the history of football tactics from the beginning to around 2008 was when the first edition came out. So they approached me and they said, we want to do like the next book in the sequence. And so essentially, a retelling of the history from around 2008 onwards. So when we were discussing what that book might look like, I was constantly pushing the fact that what works so well about Inverting the Pyramid is you have this through line, right, of the pyramid. You start off with teams front loading their attack, and then through time that pyramid flips over and becomes much more defensive. And so I was wanting to find some kind of through line through the last 15 years of football history. It lends itself very nicely, starting in 2008, to use Guardiola as that through line, because that's the year that he has his sort of breakthrough at Barcelona, wins the treble in Spain. And up until very recently, sort of dominated the space. But I didn't just want it to be a story about Guardiola, like a biography of Guardiola, because it was meant to be a history of football tactics in general. And so for me, the question was, how do we express that idea of him being sort of in the background of the story, regardless of which manager you're talking about or which tactical approach you're talking about? Because in many respects, the story of the last 15 years is that Pep was so successful that he dominated not just the titles and the competitions, but he dominated the way that we think about football itself, to the extent that for a period no one could really think outside of his terms. He dictated the conversation about football. So there was that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, I mean, we started writing the book 2 years ago. And at that point, I was already interested in this idea that maybe Guardiola's ideas were starting to shake a little bit. I mean, this is before the bad season, so in hindsight, like it looks a lot smarter than it felt at the time. And my publisher were a little bit hesitant when I was talking about the potential of talking about some kind of decline on the part of Guardiola. But then that really lends itself to the same narrative, right? He became so popular, dominated all the conversations, felt like the protagonist of reality for a huge amount of time. But then we ended up with this drop-off where suddenly it felt as though rather than dictating the terms of the conversation, he was chasing after some of these ideas and trying to catch up with other people. So yeah, for me then that presented a really nice through line. It was less so a biography of Guardiola and more so, I mean, I've called it a ghost story, and the title obviously has this concept of the Spectre of Pep as the title, and then the subtitle is How Guardiola Haunts Modern Football Tactics. And it's, again, like I chose that semantic field in on purpose, because again, I don't want this to come across as though it's just a purely positive reading of Guardiola. This isn't just about some guy who was here and dominating the sphere. And, in that respect, he haunted football simply by being everywhere. Like he had the ability for everyone to think about him all the time. But at the same time, now that he's becoming more and more absent, his approach has taken on a very different kind of, I suppose, tenor in the way that we think about it now. He's no longer that sort of ubiquitous presence. He's now sort of a shadowy presence in the room, and it's kind of like he's still here, but like what actually is his status? So that's the layout of the book in general, the through line. And it starts out with at the beginning I talk a lot about Pep. The first 3 chapters are all about Pep. Why is he so successful? What was it about his football that made it so immediately successful and better than some of the other grandees of football who were around at the time? And then we have a middle section, which is looking at the way that other coaches responded to what he did. So we talk about Jurgen Klopp in one chapter. We talk about Roberto De Zerbi in another chapter, who I think is another figure who, again, maybe has a kind of curious haunting of football, but and people have been fairly negative about him in more recent years. But I do think that his approach, his strategy, was something that was quite novel, quite new, and is still quite impactful, even if people don't talk about it. And then I have a chapter on the out of possession turn, the shift to man, and then a chapter after that looking at some of the coaches who've responded to that, particularly from, I would say, within the positional play context. But we also explore the idea of relationism in that chapter as well. And then in the final chapter, it's more about the drop off, like what happened, what went wrong in the terrible year of 24-25. And then after that, we have another chapter which is kind of looking at the way that other coaches have sort of filled in the space that was left behind when Guardiola was on his down year, and what that really tells us about the future of football. And then there's a final epilogue which just kind of explores the idea of like, what will Guardiola's legacy be once he finally leaves the game. So yeah, that's the overview of the book. It sort of hangs off Guardiola, but it's not all Guardiola, and it's certainly not like an entirely positive account of what he did. But at the same time, I think what I wanted to do is go back and give a good account of his football, because I feel as though he's often strawmanned in the modern game. People are so desperate to move beyond him because he was so dominant that they've sort of fudged the telling of the story about what he actually did. So yeah, that's the overview of the book. Pep is at the heart of it, but it's about way more than that, I think.
I think the bit that I find really interesting, in particular, about the kind of the Pep arc, if you like, is the down at the end, because I'm young enough that I don't really remember football before Guardiola. Like, I was 2 when he first took the Barcelona job and things. So football in my sphere, my world, has always been Pep's idea of football, which is why I think what's happened over the last 2 years with his downfall is so interesting, because it's the first time I've kind of seen Guardiola fall off the top of the tree, so to speak, and someone else has come to the forefront. And now you have all these new ideas of people trying to find the edge without playing like Guardiola. And there's so many different ideas. For the first time, I think the tactical landscape isn't homogenous like we've seen before. It's now quite new. And that's kind of what we want to explore today, right? We're going to talk about all the different managers and all the different ideas going on in European football at the moment, and then maybe try and pick the one that is the best at the end, which I think is impossible, but we'll have a go anyway. And I think we do have to start with Pep, because fundamentally, like, you've called it the Spectre of Pep because all these managers are inspired by Guardiola's ideas. He dominated football for so long because he was so effective. And I think when we talk about why Guardiola was so effective, there's often like a big misunderstanding that he had his football and he wouldn't budge and play any other football. It was just his system and he never adapted. And I just don't think that's true at all. I think he's really, really pragmatic. I watched a video the other day. It was like 3 hours long of all of Guardiola's tactical evolutions in one video. And when you see it in a condensed format like that, you understand how much he has evolved, whether that's using inverted fullbacks, overlapping fullbacks, back 3, back 4. Maybe it's having a more physical approach like he has at Man City, being a really aggressive press with that 6-second press rule compared to what we see now. And yes, it's not as effective. It's like a really passive press. Like, he has literally done everything. And I think that's why he's so good. He's the best coach at working within his means. He's not necessarily this idealist that he's made out to be. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. I guess I would make a distinction, right? I think I agree with you. I think the reason why he's had so much longevity, the reason why he's been so successful, is that he has an incredible ability to evolve. But I guess what I would say is he's always, up until this point, evolved within a paradigm. And that paradigm has been able to be evolved within. And that general people call it positional play. I don't like calling Pep's approach positional play because it suggests that he is the only advocate of positional play. And that's something that I've been pushing back against in the last few years. Actually, I think positional play is a tool that he uses in order to achieve his strategic ends, right? And the reason why I think that people have thought of him as being rigid is because then the reading of this positional approach has been, I think, reduced down to this sort of idea that Pep thinks in terms of space. And as a result, then you get a sort of, that the pitch is treated as like an almost universal space where all you have to do is get your players in the right positions, and the football will come, it will happen. So the players aren't really being thought of in terms of relative to anything other than the pitch itself, and the pitch never changes, right? So the structure will always be the same. I think that's a really wrong telling of the story of what positional play is about. And in the book, I use a very simple definition, which I get from Dominic Torrent, who's the assistant for Pep for many years. And he uses a very simple definition, which is basically, just off the top of my head, I'll probably butcher this a bit, but he basically says, it's thinking about the position of your players relative to the other people on the pitch. And so that's one definition, but he also emphasizes it's not just about how that helps you possess the ball, but also it structures you nicely to be able to win the ball back once you lose it. Now that's obviously a very open definition of what positional ideas are all about. And I think that Guardiola has a much more specific understanding of what that might look like. But I think it's helpful to have that general idea about positional play. The really basic one, because it then allows us to understand, what is the difference between, for example, Guardiola and then someone like Roberto De Zerbi, or even, Jurgen Klopp, or even Luis Enrique. Like, all of these coaches are using these positional ideas, and almost all elite coaches will be using positional ideas at some point in their approach. But to boil it down, positional ideas simply trying to find advantages through the positioning of your players, using the position of your players to generate these kind of advantages across the pitch. And those are, positional advantages sounds really fancy, right? But what I think everyone has an understanding of what that means. Now, often when positional coaches talk about advantages, they're talking about creating free players and accessing those free players. And what that means is, let's imagine you have the football and you want to progress the ball down the pitch. The most obvious thing for you to do is to dribble the ball, carry the ball forward. So the opponent, to stop that, will plonk someone in front of you. Now, the other option that you have is to pass the ball forward. But let's imagine that, again, an opponent stick someone in that passing lane so you can't play the ball. The idea of positional advantage then is having a third player who can help you bypass that situation. So you can pass it around the player blocking the carry or the pass, and being able to just move it through those lines of pressure to the free player behind. That's it in its simplest form. Obviously, it becomes more complex because you then end up with all of these kind of positional advantages being sought all over the pitch, and with more and more players involved and opponents doing more and more complex things to try and stop it. But that's what it is in its basic form. And I think the reason why people have to go back to what we were talking about before, the reason why people were able to make it into this sort of I guess like monolithic, rigid, structural thing is because the general idea was, well, it was always explained early on as we're trying to find these spaces in the opposition's structure, and you can boil that down to then these zones. If you have players in these zones, then you can actually move the ball quite simply. So and you end up then with these sort of arbitrary sounding rules, like you shouldn't have more than 2 players in the same channel, blah blah blah. And I think those early attempts at codifying what positional play was about in the Pep Guardiola iteration of it was that a lot of the time the language that was used was just heuristic. It wasn't necessarily indicative of what the deeper ideas were. It was just, here's a simple rule that you can tell to a player in order to achieve the ends that you want to. You talked before about the 6-second counter press rule, right? Again, that's just like another arbitrary rule, right, where you're saying in the current iteration of football, these are the kinds of rules that we're going to tell the players so that they can achieve what we want to achieve. Does that mean that those rules are going to be universal at all times in all places? Well, if you define positional play as a purely spatial logic, where you're like, well, the pitch never changes and the players have to be in these zones, then sure, you can make this argument that all that Guardiola is doing is imposing this kind of rigid set of universal laws across the game. But if we go back to the Dominic Torrent definition, where he says it's about generating advantages through the positioning of your players on the pitch relative to one another, then it's obviously a relative approach, right? The position of the players is going to change. The position of the opponents is going to change. The board that you're facing as a football team in terms of the game is going to look different every time. And so what I try and do in the second chapter of my book is set that out and give some examples of how through time, we can see evolutions of this happening. Why it might be the case that you might end up with these sort of universal rules in the first place to avoid collapsing the game into 1v1 matchups across the pitch, trying to generate those overloads that allow you to possess the ball more easily. But then through time being like, actually, you can look at both in and out of possession and see those evolutions structurally happening as the game evolves. So one of the examples that I use is the beginning of the 24-25 season, where City have just come out off the back of the FA Cup game against Manchester United at Erik ten Hag, which they lost. And in that game, United used that 4-2-4 shape, the sort of more passive press that we've talked about City using at the end. And it presented a different problem that Guardiola had to find a solution for. At the beginning of the following season, Chelsea used the same pressing shape, and City had a solution which involved using a diamond in midfield, so a 3-diamond-3, which he's used before in the past, but then using the wide midfielders to drop out into the wide channels, ending up with 3 players in one channel, which apparently is against the rules, but that being able to generate positional advantages elsewhere. So again, like the big story for me in that is that football, as Guardiola sees it, is a relative game. He's always evolving depending on what the opponents do, and the positional approach that he has chosen to adopt has the ability to evolve within that paradigm. And actually, what's interesting about the wider arc is that actually that works in a framework where opponents are using zonal logics to defend. As soon as we get that shift to man-to-man logics, it changes the framework, the frame of reference within which Guardiola is operating, because it's now no longer about finding space in opposition structures and more about generating separation from man markers. Which means I think that you can make the argument that maybe timing becomes more important than spacing in those sorts of frameworks, and as a result, the paradigm within which Guardiola has always been able to evolve starts to collapse a little bit. So we end up with a very different picture of what is required. At the same time, I would still argue that that there's positional logics operating for a lot of these coaches, but the shift, I think, is away from that more. Where shift away from a paradigm where the emphasis is more on creating space in a sort of general sense of finding the space between the lines, and more about the timing of getting your players to arrive in space. But at the same time, I think football it's always been about timing and spacing. Football is played on a football pitch. That means that time and space are going to be relative concepts the whole time, whatever you're doing, which is why I make the argument that as long as you're doing something which isn't just ball carrying or hitting the ball long and seeing what happens, you're doing some kind of version of positional play. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a sense of the sorts of conversations that are going on in the book. But I agree with you. Yeah, Guardiola evolves through time. His positional approach has the capacity to evolve. And does so within that paradigm. When the paradigm shifts to a more man-oriented focus, Guardiola realizes that he has to sort of update his positional approach in order to be able to resist that shift.
I think the interesting thing about kind of this man-oriented approach and hyper-physicality being Guardiola's decline, because teams have found a way to kind of bridge the gap between having this great quality and maybe you're a weaker team, is that Guardiola was kind of one of the first, well, not one of the first, but he's a manager who's done this in the past as well. When his Bayern Munich team played Barcelona in the Champions League, he went man for man against them because he knew he had the weaker team to try and mitigate that like gap in quality, and it didn't work. But I think the fact that he kind of found the solution before everyone else did of how to beat himself is quite interesting. But
there's also quite interesting comments that he makes. So there's a game where he plays against Arsenal. I think it's right at the beginning of 2014. It's when he's at Bayern. So it's Bayern versus Arsenal. It's a game they actually end up drawing 1-1, and they go through that leg. It's a double leg in the Champions League. And he gets really annoyed in that game because the players aren't forcing the kind of positional tensions that you need to in his system. Essentially, they're not able to create overloads. And the reason why he gets so annoyed is because he's like, all that's happening is that everything is resolving down to 1v1 battles across the pitch. That stops us from being able to generate our positional advantages. And that for me, that's like an incredible like foreshadowing of like what actually ends up happening, right? Eventually, teams recognize, wait, if we can go man to man against Guardiola, then it's impossible for him to create these overloads just through pure like spatial positioning. Then you have to bring in that concept we said before about timing and like arriving into the space, generating separation from man markers. That changes the game completely. But like Guardiola realized that was a potential problem early as 2014, right? And it's probably not until it's 10 years later before anyone really starts pushing that. And in part it's not just a tactical realization. It's also a financial evolution that happens, right? That teams become better and better equipped in the Premier League. Teams become, and it's a sports science evolution as well. Teams generate the ability to create footballers who can run for 90 minutes and man mark for 90 minutes, and then that's it, right? That you then arrive at the perfect storm to cause problems to a Guardiola approach, and then you have to have that rethink.
I think, like you say, the solutions have always been there. Guardiola has like historically struggled in the Champions League because when he comes up against these teams like a Real Madrid, for example, who have elite transition quality and elite pace, elite physicality, they can hurt you because the way you play is so proactive that you do leave space in behind, because every system has its downfalls. And like you say, what we've seen now in the Premier League is every team being able to adapt to that rather than just the elite teams. And I think this has caused Guardiola problems. I think a nice link into the managers who are dominating now, if you like, who have extended beyond Pep Guardiola, is Company and Enrique. We were talking then about how teams are going man-to-man to try and beat Guardiola, but now what we're seeing is the best teams want to go man-to-man everywhere. They want to have those 1v1 matchups because the logic is we have better players than you. In every one of those 1v1 matchups, we'll probably win the game. And there's been a lot of talk after that PSG Bayern Munich game of all great teams kind of converging towards this style of football, everyone giving up on defending and just playing in 1v1s. But I just don't think that's true, because this style of football of creating 1v1s across the pitch can only be beneficial to the best team. It can't possibly be beneficial to everyone to have, because if you don't have the superior squad, you're not going to win those 1v1 matchups. And therefore, I just can't see a world where this becomes the norm among elite teams, because even among elite teams, there will still be those who are better and there'll still be those that are worse. And it's only necessarily beneficial to those who are better, in my opinion.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things to say here. I guess one of the things I would say is that the argument that's made, and was made after that first leg of the PSG Bayern double header, was what advantage do you get from zonal defending, or anything that is sort of blocking out in a mid block, with the idea being that if you try and play that way against your Bayerns and your PSGs, they're just going to play through you. So what you're going to do is you're going to give them the majority of the ball. You're probably going to concede goals anyway, and you're going to reduce your ability to attack, right? So the argument there is that like we've almost reached the end of defending, because if you take those games, or certainly the first leg, the argument is you have the players to hurt them in attack. Don't waste your time trying to engage in an approach which is probably not going to work and is reducing your ability to be as dangerous as you can be. And yeah, I think you can push back against that as well, because like, again, that depends on the sorts of squad that you've built. Now, in time, it could be the case that we see fewer and fewer teams trying to do what Arsenal do, right? But the reality is that the Champions League final is going to be a game played between PSG and Arsenal, who are sort of diametrically opposed in terms of tactical ideology. And there's a possibility that Arsenal win that game, right? Playing more defensive, transitional football, in the same way that Chelsea did in the Club World Cup against PSG. So I think that's maybe one thing to say, that it's not just about saying, okay, we've got these great players, let's just allow this to be 1v1 matchups against across the pitch, because you're still depending on the opponent taking that agreement and being like, okay, we're just going to go 1v1 against you as well and press up. This is more about, is there any value in approaching defending in any other way? And I think the general consensus in these arguments is that we've ended up at one of two extremes. You either go man-to-man across the pitch and go aggressive, or you play super defensive, low block and counter football, which, as we know, doesn't really work, because you're giving the initiative to teams you're giving the majority of possession to these teams, and they've got good enough players to be able to break down your low block anyway. And it may be the case that you just don't generate anything on the counter. The other thing to say, which let me think what I was going to say. I think you make the point nicely that football is never just an idealistic game, right? It's football is, there's no such thing as a football team without an opponent. Every game is played between two sides, and to an extent, therefore, that means that you can't ever, in my opinion, arrive at something like the end of football, because there's always the possibility that the opponent will find a way of doing something that reduces the possibility of your own success. And so, yeah, I agree with you that I think that the reality, and I think this is what I was going to say. The reality is that it's fine for a team like Bayern or PSG to play in this way, because the conditions are set up for them to be able to do that in almost every game. I think it would be really interesting to see a Bayern or a PSG in the Premier League over the course of a season, because I don't think that you would enjoy the same kind of benefits. I mean, we're talking about a PSG season where Ousmane Dembele played 9 games or something. They were able to rotate heavy, which means, yes, you can sort of prime your players for these European fixtures where you're just going to be like, we're going to go for it. We're going to trust in the quality of our players, and it will come down to, which one of these teams is going to perform better on the night or the nights, and then you leave it at that. That's a position that many teams can't really take in general, I would say, outside of the Bundesliga and outside of Liga 1. But the other thing is that, like, after this happens a few times and Bayern, accept that trade-off, being like, okay, we're just going to go for it, you're going to go for it, and we'll see how it comes out. They do that a few times and then they lose every time. At some point, one of those teams is going to say, is this actually even worth it for us? Because if PSG are going to keep tonking us, and we're not really doing our best to try and mitigate them in any way from a defensive point of view beyond this man approach, then I suspect coaches would be like, wait a minute, let's try. There must be a way for us to even the odds out for us a little bit. And maybe it isn't between PSG and Bayern. Maybe it's like the next tier down, where it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, we're going to try and mirror what the other teams are doing. This is exactly what happened with Guardiola, right? Everyone tried to play on his terms. As soon as it didn't happen, and teams were like, wait a minute, we can do things to destabilize what these teams are doing. That's when you got the evolution. And I'm sure that would happen in this instance as well, that teams would maybe there would be in the Champions League just this general tacit agreement, all teams are going to go man and see where it ends up. But I do think in time, some teams would be like, we're just losing out here. Like, there's no point us just running into this brick wall over and over again. Let's try another approach as well. But I think it is a really interesting evolution. It makes a lot of sense. There's lots of benefits to doing that as an elite side. Like, it simplifies your defensive task. You can focus on coaching in possession stuff. And yeah, I think there's something in this idea of, if we have all of these elite attacking talents, why not just prime them for the thing they're really good at and let it go and be like, we trust our players to do that, and have that confidence that in those games you'll get through enough of them that it will be worth your while.
I think Hansi Flick is the case study for what you were talking about before, because I think he's a decent coach, but I just have a problem with his Barcelona team. I think they've got so many great attacking players, but we've seen time and time and again that in the Champions League, they don't have the defensive players to play like a PSG or a Bayern Munich, and they do just get beat, whether that's by Atletico or by Inter Milan. Like, these are sides that should not really be beating Barcelona, but because of his drive to, I'm going to play this way, I'm not going to change, and be a bit pragmatic, Barcelona keep losing because they don't have the defenders to do that. And I think there is an element there of, if he chilled out a bit, was a bit more pragmatic, I think they'd probably see better results. I think the other thing is as well that I think you can play in the middle. I don't agree that you either have to go to one extreme or the other, because Arsenal play in the middle, and I think Arsenal are one of the best teams in the world this season, especially at the start of the season. I think they were the best team in the world. They probably deserved to beat PSG last season, or if at the least it was a close game, right?
And then they beat Bayern as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think the company's idea that you have to either I'm going to go super attacking man-to-man, or the only alternative is to sit back in a deep low block, just isn't true. Because if you have elite defenders like Arsenal do, you can play in the middle if you win your duels. I think it is just really difficult to win your duels.
It's worth saying as well, like, I think the reason why we ended up at extremes is because we implemented around the 2020s these hybrid pressing approaches, right, where you're trying to get the benefit of a man-to-man approach, but also the ability to drop back into a block, which is zonal. And I think a lot of those early, like, we saw the evolution of those, and a lot of those early hybrid approaches were very manipulable and very predictable. And as a result, I think there was generally a loss of nerve from coaches. I have the concluding section of my chapter on the out of possession shift, where I look at these hybrid approaches, is that the obvious thing, I've called it back down, double down, and that's essentially what's happened, right? Like, either you've got coaches who were like super who are using hybrid approaches, going super aggressive and just being like, well, let's just go man to man all the time. Then, if we're getting caught out in these between moments where teams can trigger our press and then know where the weakness is going to be and then try and exploit that, then let's just not allow any weakness outside of man across the pitch. And then you have other coaches, you think you'd probably put Arteta in this, who they just sort of moderated quite how much they were jumping into their man-to-man phase, again because they didn't want to be caught out in these hybrid phases where, and the classic example I always use is the PSG goal against Arsenal, the first leg of their was it semi-final matchup in the Champions League at the Emirates, where essentially PSG build on one side and then they have like diagonal access into the far side, where because the press is man-to-man around the ball, it's just weaker on the far side and they have ways of pinning players and opening out that space. They get the ball to Dembele in acres of space and then they go from there. So yeah, I think it would be premature to suggest that like hybrid approaches are purely dead just because the speed with which the evolution is happening in football now has probably prompted people into the path of least resistance of like being more or less aggressive in those hybrid presses. There will be, I suspect, other approaches that emerge that maybe iron out some of those approaches. I think maybe out of possession approaches that feel a little bit more ad hoc rather than being so predictable and triggerable, which is the problem with them, right? It's like, if we play the ball to their outside centre back, these are where they're going to end up jumping the opponent. So we know where the weaknesses are going to open out. So yeah, I think you're right to have that instinct that, and this football, this always happens. Like, everyone thinks that the end of football has been reached. They've been thinking that for years. They thought that in 2014 when Spain were winning everything, they were like, this is it now, we're done. It just doesn't happen. Teams find a way in it. Right now I think we're at an extremely exciting time because like no one really knows what the solution is. You can even make the argument that the reality that we've entered into is a diverse reality where some teams are going to get the advantages of playing man across the pitch. Some teams are going to get the advantages of playing more mid-block stuff. I mean, Villa have just won the Europa League playing mid-block, like very passive mid-block stuff. They've been finishing consecutively alternate seasons in the Champions League spots. And yeah, sometimes the underlying numbers boggle the mind at how they do it, but they're doing it and it's working. So again, like this, you're not going to get an argument from anyone that those kind of approaches, which feel old-fashioned, aren't still having some kind of value there. So yeah, that's football, and it's why it's beautiful, and it's why we love it.
I think the next natural place to go then here is now to talk about Arteta, because he's kind of seen as the opposite to your companies and Enrique's, right? And I think often Arteta's branded as like this Diego Simeone-esque manager, and I just don't think that's true at all. In my head, he's kind of the next evolution of Guardiola, because what we've seen with Pep is the problem is, these teams are physical and they're transitioning really effectively. He can't control games like he used to, and therefore it isn't really a viable approach. And I think what we've seen Arteta do is shift Pep's approach more towards the physical rather than the technical, replace the open play goals. He's not scoring with corners. And all of a sudden now you have a way to control the game in kind of a Pep way. Maybe it's not as beautiful as traditional Pep football, but he is doing the same thing in terms of we're going to get you in a low block and we're going to control territory and control the game that way. And by doing that, he's been very successful. I don't think he plays like a Simeone at all. Arsenal have by far the highest defensive line in the Premier League. And I think that comparison is just really lazy.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Actually, I think it's interesting that before you mentioned Hansi Flick, right? Because I think you can make the argument that there's like a divergence in the Guardiola approach between what Hansi Flick is doing and what Arteta's doing. And I think Hansi Flick is almost like a return to the ultimate principles. You mentioned, it's funny, you said, oh, maybe it's not as beautiful as Guardiola's approach, Arteta's approach. I think a lot of people haven't really enjoyed Guardiola's approach for the last 5 years, arguably, right? And in part that is because Guardiola is motivated by risk aversion, right? He's pragmatic, which means that he's going to do the thing that works best for him in terms of getting results. And I think for a while that was primarily in an in-possession approach, right? That he wasn't taking risks on the ball because he wanted his team to defend with the ball. I think Hansi Flick is like almost going back the other way and dialing up the risk rather than risk aversion and saying, fine, we're going to do this, but we're going to go back to the original principles. We're going to go back to Barcelona, like Pep's Barcelona 2008 onwards, where you're doing a lot of the reliance on just creating very direct attacking football with players who can do that and the technicality to be able to defend with the ball and not really worry about the defensive aspect in terms of, as you talked about, that sort of physical turn that Arteta makes. So if you look at that Barcelona team, there's just there's like not really and physicality it's a funny thing to talk about in football because, I think PSG are an incredibly physical team, right? Joao Neves is like smaller than me and is incredibly like athletically like outlier. But it's a very specific type of physicality, right? And the physicality that Arteta has moved towards is this more imposing physicality, right? Where it's about duel winning and it's about the ability to run and run and run and the ability to cover large spaces. There's no one in the Barcelona team really who's doing that kind of defending to the extent that the Arsenal players are. And so the solutions that Hansi Flick found were, well, we have to rely then on counter pressing. And we have to make the spaces as small as possible. So they play with an incredibly high line, and they look to have the players close together in order to then be able to counter press and win the ball back and not get caught out in those transition moments. The problem is that it's incredibly hard to prevent any of those chances from becoming even more dangerous if you don't win your counter press and then you have a high line, right? Which is why Barcelona have played the way they have and had trouble against some teams because teams have found solutions to that high line and found solutions to that counter press. So that's one way. I would say that's sort of like that's the continuity way. That's like going back to ultimate principles. Whereas I think Arteta, as you said, has gone the other way, right? And he said, okay, the issue here now is that the needle between the needle that was sitting at sort of 70% win percentage for Pep has started to drop off primarily because his teams aren't able to defend well enough for that gamble to work out. Force the opponent into a low block, break them down more successfully than they can counter. Now that's not happening anymore. So why not then shift the needle towards risk aversion, but out of possession, and make sure our team are essentially set up to be able to defend those counter-attacking moments. And as you said, that necessarily brings with it an impact on your ability to generate open play chances. And that's where the set pieces come in, because it's like a really elegant solution, I think, to we're going to reduce our open play XG, but we are going to have a team who are camped out in the opposition's third. So we're going to win free kicks. We're going to win corners at a higher rate than normal. We're also going to have a team of players who are well suited to optimizing those set piece scenarios. And so, yeah, for me, that's the evolution of the Guardiola approach. Either go the continuity way with Hansi Flick and you lean into the risk and hope that you score more than the opposition, or you go the Arteta way, which is let's try and reduce the amount of goals as much as possible, and then hope that we're going to come out on the right side of the variance. I think the problem with that approach is that it is very risk averse, and the argument that Arsenal would want to put out in the last season is we had this process that has eventually worked, right? We've had this process for 5 years, and here we are. We've won the Premier League. We're in the Champions League final. But on the other hand, you can make the argument that the reason why they've won the Champions League this year is because the other big teams have just been in like development phases, and they haven't been able to challenge them as much as possible. You can make the argument that City were a couple of weeks late to turning their form around this season to actually winning the league. And I think that's the problem. The problem with this approach from Arteta is that, yes, it's safe, but you're relying on other teams can have more effectively productive seasons than you, and so you're relying on those teams having worse seasons than you in order to win. And I think this comes down to the fact that when you reduce the amount of goals in games, you just get bitten by variance way more. All it takes is a team to score a couple of lucky goals, and then the uphill struggle is there for a team like Arsenal. That said, I think it's incredible what they've done, and I'm with you. I think that Arsenal were the best team for the first half of the season. They dropped off a little bit, I think, in part because Arteta lent too much into, again, that risk aversion. And there was a phenomenon this season. We talked about it on our site a little bit of Arsenal sort of looking worse when they went a goal up, sort of not doing the things that they do really well in possession when they're in winning game states, largely because so much of their upside comes from positional rotations. But positional rotations are risky, right, from a defensive point of view, because if your players end up in the wrong positions when you lose the ball, then you are going to be more open. And so I feel as though Arsenal, towards the second half of the season, have been getting into winning game states and then becoming just very rigid and very passive in possession. And as a result, it's meant that teams have been able to get back in. But again, this is football. These are the trade-offs that you make. You have to, and on the basis of what's happened, Arteta will argue that trade-off paid off. But I think in the long term, I'm kind of interested to see how much success Arsenal can have with this approach, because I feel as though it may be a nice couple of seasons for them when everyone else is evolving. But the problem that could emerge for them is that these other teams then evolve into a new meta, and suddenly Arsenal find themselves just in that sort of second place there or thereabouts again, because other teams are having more successful seasons. So again, that's the trade-off that you have to kind of work with. It's all well and good looking for win windows, but at some point you're going to have to try and win when the other teams are playing well as well. So I'm kind of interested to see how that goes.
I think my counter to that would be, I think Arteta plays the best way he can with the tools he has. You can say, maybe playing like PSG, for example, or Hansi Flick is better, if you like, but Arsenal don't have the attacking tools to do that. When you look at their attack, they've got Martinelli, Gyökeres. I don't think these are particularly needle-moving players, and therefore I don't think it makes sense to build a system platformed around them. It makes sense to build around your great defenders. Even Bukayo Saka, I think when he's fully fit, he's fantastic, but he hasn't been fully fit. And I think Arteta's system can clearly be scaled by just getting more individual quality. By having better players in your system, you're going to create more chances from open play.
But
things like that, and kind of fill in the gaps, I guess.
The obvious counter to that, though, is that surely these problems that they're having now are precisely because they have lent into the defensive side of the game, right? So again, yeah, sure, add more exciting attacking players into that mix. They're going to become worse at defending, right? So the trade-off then becomes, well, is it going to iron out? Now, what I would say is that I think that Arteta will make that evolution. I think they'll have to bring in better players, and they'll have to find a way of working in the modern meta. And in that sense, that's the same problem that Guardiola has faced and is trying to overcome now, right? And I think both Hansi Flick and Arteta, you can make the argument that they need to evolve into the modern game a little bit more. So yeah, I agree with you. And again, this is not to take anything away from Arsenal. It's just more to say that it almost feels as though the tactical landscape as it is right now has kind of suited them. But what is going to happen in the next few years if it maybe starts to not suit them anymore? It could be the case that the tactical landscape, as I said, just becomes like this, right? It becomes just a diverse environment where different approaches will have different levels of success. And I think as well, because everything seems like it's flattened out a lot, things impact you way more, like external things. So like injury, for example, refereeing decisions, runs of form, making sure that you're able to get your players recovering, the age cycles of your squads, right? These things then become way more impactful. And I think that's part and parcel of the Pep era dropping off, because what you got with Pep was he didn't really have squad cycles, right? He was always very good at just making sure that his teams stayed at a relative level, and they never really dropped off when he brought in new players. Obviously, players would take a while to get up to speed, but he was able to constantly keep the squad at the same kind of level. I think we're probably going back now to an environment where squads are just going to age out much quicker because of the physical demands of what's going on. And also no one's going to have the same level of dominance that Pep had in a tactical sense, which means that, yeah, we're just going to end up with, and we're seeing it already, right? We've got Liverpool last season out of nowhere winning the title and other teams not really being able to push them. This time around, the same thing, like Arsenal winning the league, not out of nowhere, but like you could make the argument that they're past their peak under Arteta this iteration, and they were probably better in the season before, and it was a surprise that they didn't win. Again, refereeing decisions, injuries, stuff like that impacted them in that respect. And then, yeah, I could see a world where next season, another random team just has an incredible season in the league and pulls it off. That's part and parcel of like the points totals now being like mid 80s to low 80s, right? That's the reality. So yeah, I'm kind of interested to see where it irons out. I'm interested to see where Arteta goes, because yeah, I think that they won't just be happy now waiting around in sort of second place and hoping other teams have a poor season. I think they are going to want to be protagonists in a way that Guardiola was, and I'm kind of interested to see how Arteta achieves that.
I think where Arteta goes will be very dependent on what happens in the Champions League final, because I don't necessarily think we've seen a team playing Arsenal style come up against a team playing Enrique's style, which is very opposite in a huge format. Like, yes, they've played Bayern Munich, but it's the league phase of the Champions League. Bayern players missing. I don't think it's necessarily indicative of anything. So I think if Arsenal get smashed in the final, which I don't think will happen, then we'll probably see Arteta evolve. But equally, if Arteta wins, I think then that probably suggests he shouldn't be the one that evolves significantly. Then we'll probably see Enrique change. So I think that game's going to be really significant in shaping the future tactical landscape and where the meta goes.
Yeah, and I think, it may not even just be the result. It may just be the performance that is put in, because I'm just thinking back to the Carabao Cup final where Arsenal's like approach was just it just felt super weak in that game, that they sort of opted to not concede and then conceded and then didn't really know what to do. And I think if the same thing happens in another final where they don't seem to really have any solutions to what a team who is going to be proactive and is going to be trying to generate chances and goals, then yeah, I think it may play out that then he has a bit of a rethink. Even if they smash and grab, right, it will probably raise a question about how optimal that kind of approach is going to be. My sense of it is that they probably are on the wrong side of what is functional right now, and I'm sort of interested to see. Yeah, I mean, you're right. This final is going to be the test. It's going to be a good matchup, and I can see them winning it. Even though I think that PSG are probably comfortable favourites. So yeah, but again, like how much of that comes down to the fact that everyone enjoys watching PSG and doesn't really enjoy watching the general fan doesn't enjoy watching Arsenal stodge out games. So it could just be an aesthetic bias that is in play here. And actually, when we get into the game, it could just be, whatever.
I think the interesting thing as well about Enrique's PSG is that they're not necessarily that dominant in terms of performances. Yes, they beat Chelsea 8-2, but when you look at the chances the teams actually had in those games, it's fairly even. I think the reason they win so many games is because they have freakish finishers like Dembele and like Kvaratskhelia, especially this season, who are massively overperforming their XG, so they can score off absolutely nothing. But from a strategic perspective, does that then mean that this strategy isn't necessarily implementable for other teams that don't have these freakish finishes? Because say Arsenal played the exact same way, they generate the exact same chances. Is Gyökeres scoring the chances Dembele is EL? And then you lose those games despite the strategy being the same. And I think looking at the performances more than necessarily the outcomes of the goals is probably more important, like you said about the final.
Yeah, and with PSG, I totally agree with your point. Like, there's so many games where you watch them, and from a sort of tactical point of view, they're not dominating in the way that you expect a team like that to dominate, right? But people forget that PSG team is essentially just a transition team. They're going to look to generate artificial transitions with the ball, and they're going to try and generate transitions when they win the ball back. And as a result, then they don't have that same kind of control element that we've seen across so much elite football. And I think that because they're because they're obviously a good side, people think of them as just sort of being a kind of, well, they're a possession team who yeah, you want to control the ball, and to an extent that's true, but like the extent to which they control the ball is that they have that build-up unit of like three players in the back line, and then Vitinha in front of them, or Vitinha dropping into that back line with someone ahead of him. And then they generate a huge amount of space between that build-up unit and the rest of the team, with the idea being that they want to create open space because the players that they have are just going to kill you if they get the ball in those kind of situations. And it's an incredibly risky way of playing, right? Because if you lose the ball in those scenarios, and this is what the Chelsea what's it called? Sorry, Club World Cup. Yeah, that final was all about that, right? It was about Chelsea being brave to press them in those moments when they were doing build-up and trying to turn the ball over, prevent them from generating any of their transition moments. But at the same time, Chelsea being brave and just going long against them and putting players who, when the ball's aerial and the game becomes more physical, under pressure. So I could see Arsenal doing that as well. And yeah, I think that, again, all it would take is for Arsenal to come up against PSG on a bad finishing day, and it will be very winnable for them. But at the same time, I could see Arsenal potentially losing 3-0, 4-0, just because they have an incredible finishing day, right? And I guess that's kind of where we started out with, right? This idea of like the shift from this concept of football where domination has to be thought about in the Guardiola Arteta way, right? Which is, we create the conditions within which our success is more likely, to this approach now, which is like, to hell with the conditions. We have the better players. Let's just make sure we have moments where they are going to be able to excel. That's an incredible risky way of playing. But then I guess if everyone has great players, and that's the argument about why it's the end of defending, right? The argument is, well, you can't defend these players, so you might as well just lean into attacking with them. So yeah, I think that, it's the sort of approach where, it's the sort of game where the outcome will determine the future conversations about football tactical history, in probably an unhelpful way, to be honest, because I'm just a counterfactual guy. I'm always just like, well, how would the conversation change if the outcome changed? And if the outcome is, even 60-40 in PSG's favor, right? Even if it's as biased as that, that's still 40% likelihood for Arsenal to get something out of it. And that for me is like a justifiable approach to a game from a tactical point of view. So yeah, I think that we probably will be biased by the result of this game. But I don't think we should really ever read into like 90 minutes of football as indicative of where the future of the tactics history is going.
I think the boring outcome probably is that it continues in a similar way that it is at the moment, where there isn't really a significant meta like we've seen with Guardiola for so long, and you just have a more diverse tactical landscape. Because I think build-up has changed so much. Like we think of the best teams have to control games, but I just think it's so difficult to control games now. Like even Arsenal have been poor at times this season because they can't build up, and I think that's just because pressing has reached a point where it is so good, it's so difficult to build up. Like you don't really see any team anymore that can frequently play through the first phase really comfortably. And it's like when you go back and watch old Man City games or old Barcelona games, like they would just give the centre back the ball and the opposition would let them carry it to the halfway line and let them settle possession, and that just doesn't happen anymore. So maybe because of that, playing a controlled style of football just becomes less optimal and less viable for the majority of teams.
Yeah, and I argue in the book that it's just this is still Guardiola's legacy, right? Guardiola sets up an approach which is about dominating with the ball, and then teams respond to that by making it impossible for teams to dominate with the ball. That's still an impact and legacy of Guardiola. Like the world that we're entering into now has still got the shades of Guardiola sort of haunting it in the background, precisely because the only reason we're where we are now is precisely because he was so successful at doing what he did. So yeah, and the build-up point is incredibly prescient. I think people don't realize it, but if you go back, I watched a game from Guardiola's maybe second season recently, and it's just I mean, not to mention the fact that like it's weird watching players not be allowed in the penalty box for like goal kicks, but you end up with this weird thing where the centre backs are like either side of the box because they're so deep, and that means they have to go wide. But then, yeah, teams were sort of like thinking about pressing, but then, essentially the ball is played out to John Stones on and right centre back with zero pressure on him, and he has the ball for like 10 seconds, carries it forward. Bernardo Silva drops into a cavernous space in midfield, and Stones plays the ball to him. He bounces the ball back because he's under a little bit of pressure. Stones has the ball for another 6 seconds, and eventually just carries it to the halfway line and just has an open pass to Raheem Sterling in the right channel. That stuff just doesn't happen anymore. And as a result of that, the control element is that you are able to slow the game down and make it more feasible to build. The game speeds up when the pressing is happening. The game speeds up because now ball progression is no longer about consistent universal build up through the thirds. It's about how do we get through the first lines of their pressure and then find the space in behind. For City, it's like how do we access Nico O'Reilly in the second or third line, and then he carries the ball at speed at a back line, and we run off that with our front three, run off that back four. It's just a completely different game to what it was, and even within I think 5 years, I think 1920 season is when it really starts. We really start moving into those hybrid approaches where teams are like, we're confident that we can press man to man against an opponent's build up, and from that point onwards, it's the game has just changed completely, and people don't realize it. I think there's still this belief there's just no good teams out there anymore. All we need is for these teams to bring in some good players, and then we'll be back where we were. But I think, as I say in the book, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. This is different.
I think the good players are still there, I'd argue as well. I think people have an obsession with saying like 10 years ago, there were so many better players, but I think the game was just more about the individual and therefore the players stood out more. Whereas now I think it's more about the collective. Like when you look at Arsenal, I'd argue that Bukayo Saka is as good as a winger as whoever was some of the best elite wingers.
Stick Saka in that Barcelona team, and he would absolutely shine. I watched a clip of that Barcelona team the other day, and it's incredible how poor defending was back then. And people get annoyed by this, right? And I understand why, right? Because we want to believe that everything was better in the past, and we want to believe that football is going to be fun again in the future. But you see Busquets receive the ball in like a tennis court of space, and then look at his options, play the ball to, Xavi or Iniesta in between the lines with no one on them. And you're just like, that just simply does not happen anymore. You have no time to control the ball, no time to sort of assess what you're doing. And actually what the players can do now is astounding in how good they are. To the extent that, you would take a very low thought of player in the Premier League right now and stick them in that context, and people will be like, this guy is next level. That's just what happens when you professionalize football and you hyper financialize football to the extent that it's been done. Actually, everyone becomes so much better that the overall spectacle becomes worse, and people view those players as worse when the reality is it's the exact opposite of what's happened.
I think they're relatively worse. I'm glad you've said that as well. I did a video on TikTok the other day where I said I think the majority of good teams now would probably beat the best teams they definitely would beat the best teams of like 2010. I think the example I used in the video was I think Arsenal would probably beat Pep's Barcelona team just because they're better, because they're modern. And people thought that was insane, but I don't think it is, because stuff just gets better over time. And maybe that's an extreme example. But especially when you look at other examples, like, for example, if you put PSG against 08 Man United, I think they would absolutely trounce them just because tactically they're so much more advanced. Physically, they're so much more advanced in terms of the pressure. I mean, I made that video because I was watching 09 Barcelona against Bayern Munich in the Champions League final when they beat them 4-0. And like, on one hand, yes, this Barcelona team is obviously really, really good and they're far more advanced than anything else at that time, but equally the defending is like, it's horrific. They just let Gerard Piqué come to the halfway line with no pressure on him, and it's not like they're in a structured block with every player's behind the ball. Like you have a striker maybe stood behind him because he can't be bothered to get back. And then the gap in between the defensive line is massive. And with a simple little, just let Eto drop off into that space. Nobody follows him at all. He has all the time in the world to turn. And then then they decide to drop, and you've got like Henry running behind, Messi running behind. I just think if you put a team like Arsenal up against that team now, things like that simply wouldn't happen, and you'd probably get a game where they win.
People want to believe that talent is some kind of like innate thing, but it almost never is. It's almost always the product of the environment that you're working in. And the reality is that the environment that players are working in now is so professional. Compare some of these players from like you're talking about there in 2009 with a player coming through today. Even, I don't know, just take someone random like James Garner. Like James Garner has been going through the system since he was probably 6-7 years old. He will have been managed fitness-wise, nutrition-wise, development-wise to within an inch of his life the whole time. And yes, like there's a level of misery to that what this has become about is production line football. And I hear the critiques, the people who say football should be about expressing yourself. But the reality is that there's so much money in the game now that these processes are micromanaged. And the result is, yes, on the one hand, maybe you're reducing the possibilities, the glorious possibilities of creativity that are available to a player like that. But you're also opening a huge amount of possibilities as well, whereby, if you pick that player up 7 years later, they probably aren't going to reach the same level because they haven't had that early process, the development process, where they are fit enough to be able to do what they're doing. They're technical enough to be able to do what they're doing. They're able to move quickly enough to do what they're doing. They're mobile enough, etc. All of this stuff comes from that production line approach. And the result of that is that, I think if you compared any of those players to players 20 years ago, just from a purely physical output point of view, it would just be there'd be no comparison. And that's why the game has become what it's become, 1v1 matchups, because like all of these players are now peak physical condition. If you went man to man with these teams nowadays against those teams then, there would just be no possibility of them keeping up with them. And that's the reality. It's not a talent thing at all, really. It's a producing the level of athleticism that can allow you to do that. And then talent is something which is then pasted on at the top. And again, like, it sounds miserable just saying it like that, but that's the reality. That's the reality of why the football in the Premier League has gone the way it's gone, right? Because there's a realization that there's almost like a path of least resistance here, which is as long as we have physically imposing players, even if they don't have the technical level, they'll still be able to compete in those duels. So it won't matter so much. So and then the question is like, how do we impose those sort of more technical aspects onto the team on top of it? That's the modern problem, right? It's like hit the baseline of defensive solidity and then worry about the goals that you're going to score. Miserable, but like it's that way because teams need to win because there's so much money in the game.
I think you see that with recruitment too. I think especially with Manchester City at the moment, like Kushnov is such a good example of that. I think when we signed him, he's a player that has these elite physical traits. Like he's really fast, really strong. But as a footballer, I think he was a bit questionable, if I'm honest. Like he wasn't fantastic on the ball. His reading of the game wasn't up to the level of a Manchester City centre-back. And what we've seen over the last season or two is you can develop the footballing side. Like now he's pretty decent on the ball. He reads the game certainly better than he did. And you'd predict the trajectory that, he'll come and be a world-class centre-back in a few years. Obviously, progression isn't always linear, so he might not be, but that is kind of what you'd think. But if you bought a centre-back who at the same age as Kushnov is elite on the ball, reads the game fantastically, they've never got the potential to reach that level because you can't teach speed and strength to the same extent that you can coach the on-ball ability.
I think as well, it's an interesting example of how the game has moved on, right? Because if you compare Kushinov and Guehi to, I don't know, Stones and Laporte, it's like a completely different skill set of player. And the reason why Guardiola has gone for those kind of players, I think, is because, you've got like in Kushinov, like incredible athleticism to be able to defend backwards. And then with Guehi, like really good ability 1v1, right? It's the requirements of what your centre-backs do has become no longer about high volume progression. And it's become about being able to defend those moments. And the high volume progression now has moved up into the second line, right? So if you watch City now, it's Rodri and Bernardo Silva, often even dropping into those centre-back spots sometimes, right? With the two centre-backs spreading wide, and them doing the work of that. That's the way that the game has evolved. It used to be the case that you had space in the first line, so you needed your progressive players to be in that first line. Now the space is behind the opposition press, so you need to have your good small space players in those first and second lines. And again, like we can talk all we want about wanting to go back in time, but that's not going to happen until the next evolution occurs.
I think that's why I find it so insane as well that Manchester City's gone for a goalkeeper like Donnarumma, because we talk about how build-ups got extremely difficult. And I think a lot of the things you talk about there are equally, yes, they are because of the tactical landscape, but I think a massive reason why they're happening is also the fact that we have a goalkeeper that can't really pass the ball. So you need to try and mitigate that through guys like Rodri and Bernardo Silva. But like you say, we're in a landscape now where everyone's pressing man-to-man, everyone's pressing really aggressively. The way you can beat that is by creating an overload with your goalkeeper is the obvious solution. And you've just said, oh, we don't want that solution because we want a guy that's going to save a higher percentage of shots. And yes, he does that, but equally, because we can't build out, you just end up in these game states of chaos all the time, and we face a lot more shots. I find it bewildering that someone as genius as Pep Guardiola has gone for this option.
Yeah. And, again, the argument there isn't just, oh, well, if we have a good ball-playing goalkeeper, we're suddenly going to be able to keep the ball against high presses. The point is precisely that if you have a good ball-playing goalkeeper, you have the best opportunity to exit those pressing moments in the most effective way, right? And that's the point. The point is that if you can play through those first few lines of pressure in a controlled way, you're finding the ball to Nico O'Reilly, who then carries the ball at that back line. If you're not, you're going long, and then yes, okay, maybe you win the second ball, maybe you win the first ball, and you generate some kind of like potential turnover situation. But again, those scenarios are so much lower value than actually being able to play your way through the press. And I think that's the thing for me with Donnarumma is that, yeah, okay, fine. Like the general idea is that you're not going to try and exit the press cleanly every time. But the problem is that you see things that he's doing and he's reducing the ability of the team to actually play those controlled escapes from the press. And that, as a result, makes City worse in possession. That's just the way that modern football is. So, but, I don't know. I go easy a little bit on Pep in terms of the fact that, everyone wants to read the history in a linear fashion where it's like neat and tidy. But, the reading that I would have of the last couple of years is that the bad season happens. Guardiola thinks the reason why this is bad is because none of my players are up to the task physically. And you can make the argument that, a lot of those players are aging out, right? There's a bunch of them are over 30. Bernardo turns 30 at the beginning of the season. De Bruyne is obviously miles off the pace. And then you've got like Kyle Walker off the pace. John Stones is injured all the time. And I think that Guardiola thinks all we need to do is just refresh the squad and we'll be able to go back to what we did before. So then you look at the players that were signed in the summer, and it was Aït-Nouri, right, and Reinders, which is almost like the continuity approach we talked about before, where it felt as though Guardiola was just leaning into what he'd done before and being like, okay, let's go for it. Like, obviously, they signed James Trafford, and that seems to fit in with that. But then they also signed Donnarumma at the end of the window, which just doesn't really make much sense. But then you compare that with the January transfers when they bring in Guehi and Semenyo, and it's quite clear that Guardiola is like, okay, we're going to have to take a different approach here. We're not just going to be able to go back to what we had before. And I think you have to give space for coaches to actually make those decisions in real time. I think it's easy for us to sit outside and be like, well, obviously this is the solution, bang, bang, bang. That's never the way that it is when you're working with a group of players and you're implementing ideas and you're having to build a squad as you go and you're having to decide which players to let go, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, the same's true of Arteta. Like I said it before, like there's this desire to narrate what's happened with Arsenal as being some kind of like perfect linear plan where they sat down in 2019 and they had all of these phases where they're like, we're going to do this and we're going to do this and we're going to do this, and they do all of this and they win the league. So it's like, wow, incredible causality, lads. We've really nailed it. But then you actually look at the details of what happens, and in 2019 they're like, we're not going to sign anyone over 40 million euros and we're going to sign players under 23. That season they signed Ben White for more than 40 million. Following season they signed two players, I think, for over 40 million. And the following season they're then buying like Kai Havertz and Declan Rice for like tons of money. And it's like those sorts of things, but get like really written out as being, oh, this was an incredible like turnover of the whole. But like they obviously, as they went, they were like, oh, we do need this player. This player is more than we've. And that's the thing that should be celebrated there. It's like actually the teams that do well are the teams who are nimble, and they don't have these like over the top narratives where it's like, oh, we set this out we set all this in store as we were going, and we got there. But I've just written a book where essentially the publisher approached me and said, do you want to write a book? And I was like, yeah, sure. And the publisher was like, okay, I'm going to be in London tomorrow. Just come, let's go for a drink and bring with you, like, just bring a structure of what you think this book might look like. And I did that. I turned up literally with an envelope where I just jotted a few ideas down. It was like 12 hours later, so there was not really a huge amount of time to think about it. Now, if you look at that structure actually is what the book looks like. That, generally speaking, I maybe squeezed a few chapters together and changed a few bits here and there. The structure is there. But the reality is that in writing the book, I made mistakes which then I corrected, and I found different ways of saying things, and I went in different routes than I would have done at the beginning of the book. And that is not to say that I was wrong at the beginning and that structure wasn't good. But the reality is that life is always way more messy than your overarching structures are going to be. And I think that we should celebrate teams who are good at making those tweaks as and when they emerge. I think Arteta has done that a lot. He's realized he's made mistakes and changed his mind. He realized that William Saliba was a great centre back and brought him in, right? It's little things like that. We should celebrate that, and we shouldn't just sit here being like, we can only celebrate this title if every stage of the way was like an important causal step. No, all of these things are non-linear. Things happen, shit happens. The world is a complicated place. Things go wrong, things go right in ways that you don't know that they're going to go right. Right? You can make the argument that Arsenal had this win window of between whatever it was, 2022 and 2027. And yeah, they've got there and they won in that window. But like the tactical landscape literally changed in that window, and they had no clue that was going to happen. Their projection wouldn't really have included that. It was really based on like squad age curves for opponents and various things like that. So I just think when we're telling the history, and this is something I've tried to do in the book, I do bang on a little bit about historiography, but I just don't think history is a simple thing. There's like multiple narratives, there's multiple timelines, there's things that happen out of your control, and the best teams are always the ones where they are nimble on their feet and they can respond to adversity, and they don't get lazy and idle when they have success. They're constantly pushing to find those fine margins. That's the story of Arsenal winning the league. It's that impressive ability to constantly find those margins, to constantly retain the motivation to do what they're doing. And I think we should celebrate that.
I think that's what's made Pep Guardiola great as well. I think we started this podcast by talking about how he's not an idealist and he's pragmatic, but that's why he's great. When you look at Manchester City's most successful seasons, almost all of them happened because of some sort of adversity at the start. Like the Centurions, for example, we started off with a back three and this idea of having Ben Mendy on the left and Kyle Walker kind of bombing up as real touchline width holder fullbacks. And then Mendy does his ACL about 10 games into the season, and he has to reinvent by using Fabian Delph, of all people, as like an inverted fullback. And because of that, then you get Sane and Sterling coming back into the team and you get this wonderful winning formula. Same thing with like the treble season. The first half of that season was pretty bad. Like you're trying to solve problems by going through Rodri all the time, and then he realized the solution is John Stones because of adversity. Like you say, the best teams are the managers who can be pragmatic and respond to the situations they have, and that's why I think Arteta's a genius, because he does that really well.
Yeah, agreed on both points. And, I think Pep gets beaten by the stick of, he spends loads of money. But the point with Pep is that, like, that money is always worthwhile because he eventually finds ways of making it work, right? Like you say, John Stones being used as a solution, like a number of seasons after he's brought in, is why Guardiola is brilliant. Not because he just had John Stones, but because he realised the way that he could use John Stones to solve a tactical problem at that point in time. And that's what it's about, right? You could put a number of people in charge of those Manchester City teams, and they wouldn't have had anywhere near the success that Guardiola had, particularly once Jurgen Klopp was on the scene, which was, very soon after he arrived.
I just find money arguments really lazy, because people only want to talk about spending money being an advantage when the spending's successful, because every big team spends money now. It's not really an advantage. I think spending's only necessarily an advantage if you're spending more relative to your peers. Otherwise, you're just the same. It's like it's been used against Arsenal this season. It's like, oh, you've won the league, but you had to spend $1 billion to get there. And it's like, well, great. Man United have spent 1.5 billion and got nowhere really. Chelsea have spent 2 billion and they're 10th. It's like, it's not the spending that's the reason they're here. It's because you've got a great coach. If anything, the spending puts them as a disadvantage because they're spending less than their competitors.
Yeah. No, I agree totally. And again, it's like everything is, like we said, that everything is non-linear, right? These things, in order to compete, you have to spend money, but spending money doesn't guarantee success, right? So what you want is a coach who is going to be able to deal with players you've spent big money on. It's like, of course, Guardiola is a great coach. Of course, Arteta is a great coach because the return on investment that these owners have got from them has been worth their while. That's the reality of it. And it's, people are always willing to do the lazy narratives, which is, oh, this coach has spent loads of money there and they've been bad. Therefore, the coach is shit. This coach has done really well. They spent loads of money. So this coach is shit. It's like, what do you want? Like, what's the middle ground between those two things?
I think you've got to win with a full academy team like Alex Ferguson did.
You've got to drop down
the fact that he also spent lots of money.
You've got to drop down to the lower leagues, right, and win something to prove that you're a good coach, right? That's the solution here, I think.
So Pep Guardiola should turn down his job at Man City and he should have gone to Blackburn instead. Won there. We'll finish off by talking a little bit about Enzo Maresca as well, because I think he's really interesting at the moment because he is just the closest thing to Pep possible. And the fact that we've chosen to go for him and kind of continue on with this Pep style as close as you can when it's not necessarily been that successful over the past 2 years, I think is interesting instead of diverting the other way. Because I think Maresca's got a decision to make now this summer, because what we've seen this season for me is Man City being between two styles of, okay, we want to keep doing what Guardiola's been doing for ages with kind of his idea of positional play, slow build-up, yada, yada, yada. But then we also want to play fast and go on transition. Like we've brought in Pep Linders, we've brought in Donnarumma, you've got Haaland, Doku. And I think we've just ended up in the middle, which is the worst place to be because you're just kind of doing nothing. It's a weird blend. And I think if Maresca wants to be successful, he has to make a decision of, are we going to evolve more towards the fast transitions or are we going to evolve back to what Pep was doing, which I think is probably the more likely thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment. I mean, I guess in my head, like the reality is that the ideal solution is to find something in the middle, right, between fast and slow that works. And I think that's the way that maybe the game is going, because I think, you can make the argument, it's tempting to make the argument that like Barcelona and Bayern and PSG just play fast all the time, but they find ways of slowing the play down from there. So one of the things I've talked about a lot this season is those sorts of teams, when they come up against a low block in particular, rather than just sort of camping out against that block and just looking to manipulate them in the final third, often you'll see these teams now resetting and trying to pull the opponent's block out, which is much easier to do, right? Because a lot of teams now use backwards passing as a trigger to step up and to, press. So yeah, I think that's one of the, and again, I have a section in the book called Playing Fast and Slow and talking. Again, it's very early days because I was writing this while the history was unfolding. So it's, I by no stretch of the imagination do I have any like long-term fixes here, but it's funny writing the history as it's happening because I think now I'm kind of quite interested in the way that these teams meld together, playing fast and slow. Maybe the issue with the Guardiola approach is that like playing fast and slow are so almost incommensurable, right? It's hard to get those two things together in quite the right way. In part, that's probably because of the players that Guardiola has at his disposal. But at the same time, I think I could see a couple of squad tweaks, and then you end up with a squad where you can like play fast, you can play slow, you can make it so that the things that are problematic about the old way aren't there as well. And again, like the what I talked about there, decompressing the block by playing backwards. In the past, Pep would have tried to break that block down by pulling the press apart, right? And you do that by spreading yourself wide, which is already going to cause you problems for like transition moments, but also by having runners in behind, right, to sort of pull the back line apart and create space in front of that back line in order to work your way through it. But again, having players running in behind means that you're not well placed for counter pressing, which means that if you lose the ball, then you're in danger of being counter-attacked on. And so this way of like forcing a low block and then maybe working it a little bit, but then saying, okay, we're not getting anywhere with this. Let's reset. Let's go back. Let's pull them apart. that is still retaining possession of the ball, and it's still generating the space that you might then be more able to exploit with the kind of players that you have if you have a squad that's built for playing faster. And so I think that that's like the obvious direction of travel to go from here. These ways of like optimizing your squad, optimizing the game for the squad that you have, right, in a tactical sense. And I think maybe that's where the next step will be. The other thing to talk about is obviously positional rotations, but as we've said, like with Guardiola, with Arteta, if you have an incredibly like rotating approach to ball possession, you are leaving yourself exposed to the possibility of being killed in the counters as well there, right? So I see this fast and slow approach as maybe a compromise approach there, but I think as well with Maresca, to bring it back to the original question, the question is, where does he evolve? Which direction does he evolve? And I think it's sort of hard to read Maresca because, you know, he's had his managerial career really outside of his time in Italy was he had a period at Leicester where he had to implement like a high Pep positional approach. And you do that by often leaning into the rigidity a little bit more and making it the kind of approach that people straw man when they say this is what all positional approaches are. He was only at Leicester for a year, right? So, and, you know, obviously they got the promotion and it worked. He was there for a little bit longer at Chelsea. And I think the question is like, how much flexibility did we see entering into that approach in the second season? And yeah, you know, I think that's the question that has to be had. I think when he first arrives at Chelsea, obviously the team are playing much more direct football because of Pochettino, who's just preceded him. And then you have that famous switch midway through the season where, yes, they're having a huge amount of like attacking upside because they're playing direct football, but they're getting munched in counters when they lose the ball. So he then moves back to a really kind of rigid positional approach in a bid to actually control possession in a way where they're not giving up those transitions. And that's the question then is, well, it felt very much like he was moving in the opposite direction to the way that football was moving there. So I suppose the question that I have in my mind is like, to what I think it's pretty clear that in the second season he started introducing more rotational elements into it, more fluidity, more flexibility, trying to work on the relations between the players in certain areas of the pitch so that they could generate those kind of upsides as well. The question is like, how well would he do that at Manchester City? And, you know, I guess the beauty of him being at City would be that a lot of the basics are already known by all of the players, right? So you don't have to start with the overly rigid approach to begin with. You could start with that as the baseline and start introducing a lot of the. I mean, he could probably just take what is there already and start workshopping it. But I think that, you know, there's a risk there. Like, we've not seen that he's able to thrive with an elite team in this environment at this point. Now, it could be the case that he will evolve, and he's a very young manager, so there's no reason why he wouldn't. But it still remains a risk, especially for a club like City, where they're so used to having just success regardless. I mean, Guardiola's worst season of all time, like, they still got Champions League football. They still got to the FA Cup final, arguably, like, played well enough to win that FA Cup final. That's the reality of what they're working with. If Maresca comes in and they don't hit that kind of level immediately, then, you know, it will be interesting to see how they deal with it. So yeah, I think it's a risk. But if he's going to be good, he's going to evolve. And if he isn't, he's not good enough, in which case you move on and you get someone else. I can see why they're taking the risk. But I also think it's an incredibly hard job to step into the shoes of someone like Pep Guardiola.
I think I'd apply some Vincent Kompany logic to it, almost, of if you can dominate with the dominant side in the Championship. I think that's more similar to trying to dominate to Manchester City in the Premier League because you have the dominant side than it is being a successful manager with like the 5th best squad in the league.
Yeah,
I think there's more similarities there than people give credit for.
Kompany example is great. I think the Kompany example is great, right? Because Kompany has evolved in Bayern, and we're now talking about him adopting this like much more aggressive approach. I get the impression that Maresca doesn't have the same mentality. Like, he's got those famous quotes where he talks about freedom and not wanting to just, freedom is a word that's bandied around a lot in football tactics because everyone wants to be like, oh, give the players freedom, right? And it's always explored, the notion of freedom, right? It's always like whenever they talk about freedom, it's like a negative account of freedom, which is like you need to free the individuals from any kind of boundary so they can do what they do. But I think that Guardiola and Maresca operate with a concept of freedom, which is you actually impose certain strictures on some players so that your better players can be free to do the things that are good for them. So a good example of that is like Bernardo Silva sort of babysitting Ryan Cherky at the beginning of this season. I think actually the better solution has been, finding a different role for Cherky later on in the season. But that's the kind of ideas that Guardiola operates with. It's like, okay, if this player is willing to do the hard work, and every football club has this, right? Centre backs are structured incredibly, right? No one is out here being like, look at this centre back being his freedom's being imposed upon because he has to follow the striker around the pitch. That's just the reality. If you don't do that, you get battered. But the centre-backs do that in order that there's a defensive base for the attacking players to work from, right? And that kind of logic follows across the pitch. But at the same time, yeah, I think, the ability to sacrifice that is clearly in the up. We're talking about company there, like this idea of like, let the players sort of have a relative amount of freedom. Although weirdly enough, like the man-to-man approach, I'm just thinking about it now, it's like often you'll see like Harry Kane and Leonard Carr like ending up in the centre back zones. That's like even less free than like what Guardiola's getting is from his strikers. But again, the point here is that like freedom isn't just a thing that is simple. It's a complicated concept. There's plenty of different ways that you can structure it. There's plenty of different ways you can think about it. And it seems as though Maresca has this maybe more structured or collective concept of freedom, where other coaches might want like more individual concepts of freedom. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see to what extent that concept of collective freedom allows him the ability to introduce fluidity and dynamism into his team, which I think you need to in a world where teams are going man-to-man, because you have to create space by, as we've said, generating separation from man markers rather than introducing kind of more rigid structural approaches where actually the advantages just emerge from the reality that those structures provide. So, yeah. I'm kind of interested to see where Maresca goes.